In recent years, a handful of YouTubers have run social experiments where a certain number of players, usually 100 to 1,000, would be dropped in a world with certain rules to abide by, with the goal of building a civilization. It started with YouTuber MagicGum, who had been theorizing on his channel about how human history would have been different if humanity existed in Minecraft. He ran this social experiment to test these theories in 2021. He started by making a public server where people who died would be temporarily banned to mimic the risk of death that real life posed. Consequently, the server was thrown into a series of endless murders as players found it satisfying to be able to temp ban people by killing them. MagicGum tried to remedy this by adding a reputation system, which only worsened the issue as players tried to speedrun to the worst reputation. In an attempt to steer his experiment in the direction he wanted, he created a formal event that would run for specific times during a set number of days, along with set rules to attempt to guide the players into cooperating with each other. In this first experiment, he put 100 players into different 100 by 100 block boxes with different biomes and resources, along with sending RDMers to their own box called Australia to form a prisoner colony. The goal of the experiment was to see how different groups reacted to the available resources and how that changed the way they organized themselves. MagicGum's rules had to be very strict and very guided to get players to cooperate, the most blatant of these rules being literally telling them, form a civilization to advance to the next level. The next level being trading and interacting with other civilizations. Similar rules, or at least expectations, had to be implemented in most following experiments done by MagicGum, Ish, and other large creators. I'd like to propose that the reason players had to be forced to cooperate by weeding out antisocial players and imposing rules and expectations was because of the individualistic nature of Minecraft's production loop, and that if this individualistic production loop was replaced by a social production loop, players wouldn't need to be coerced into cooperation by outside rules, and would lead to much more interesting and divergent experiments. First, let's analyze why MagicGum had to resort to outside rules and expectations to get players to cooperate, whereas these external rules were not needed in real-life social development. The simple answer is that in Minecraft, every player is able to meet their individual material requirements fairly easily. This is something to be expected, considering the game would be very boring if you couldn't play without 20 other people. Cooperation is only useful in reducing the time needed to produce the materials to satisfy those requirements. Take, for example, food. Ignoring the fact that lack of food won't kill you outside of hard mode, food is exceptionally easy to get by either making a small farm or by simply hunting some of the many passive mobs that spawn in abundance, mobs which will not defend themselves. Food security for each individual player can be reached by each individual player working on their own. This means the only reason players would work together to provide food security is if they collectively just wanted to, or if there was an external expectation or rule to do so. Next, let's move on to housing. Housing is something that is required to protect players from hostile mobs. Basic housing can be built with any block and can be constructed within the first 30 seconds of spawning. The only reason players would work together to provide housing is if they wanted to build something more, well, pleasing to the eye at a faster rate than working alone. Or if they just all wanted to, take you and your friends teaming up to build a town, for example, or if there was an external expectation or rule to do so. This goes on with nearly everything you would need or want to do in Minecraft. I call this the individualist production loop, referring to how each individual player can gather all of the resources and craft, build, or grow everything necessary to meet their material needs and complete their wants or goals. The option to work together is there, but it's not required. Because of this, players who want to go around murdering everyone can do so. These aspiring murderers can work by themselves to provide themselves housing, food, weapons, armor, etc. Hence the need to require cooperation and to weed out those who choose to go it on their own. From this analysis, the solution to creating a naturally developing Minecraft society is clear. Make it extremely hard or impossible for each individual player to produce their material needs by themselves. If they cannot by themselves provide food security for themselves, or housing for themselves, or weapons or armor for themselves, then these conditions, their material conditions, make it impossible for players to go off on their own and become antisocial axe-wielding maniacs. And moreover, it makes it extremely important for players to cooperate to meet their material needs, leading to the formation of social relations of production in the process. I call this the social production loop in Minecraft, where players need to work together in a coordinated way to gather the resources and craft, build, or grow their material requirements. This is why Minecraft civilizations fail to create their own unique societies, and typically build off of preconceived notions that players bring from real life, such as we need to build a democracy, or empire, or kingdom, or dictatorship, instead of a social organization evolving from their existing conditions. In real life, it's extremely difficult to provide for yourself all of your material needs by yourself, and therefore why humans necessarily form social relations of production to be able to produce in sufficient quantities the material requirements of life. This is why social anxiety is rooted in our DNA, because our ancestors who were scared of being shunned or exiled by their tribe would be biologically incentivized to cooperate and to form these relations to avoid being left to fend for themselves. Of course, we don't need to simulate anxiety in Minecraft, we just need to provide the conditions which gave rise to it. Here are some general recommendations. 1. Increase the required usage of food or decrease the yield of food sources. 2. Increase the cost of housing or increase the drawbacks of lack of housing. 3. Increase the cost of tools, weapons, and armor. 4. Increase the material requirements for players, such as adding thirst, tiredness, etc. 5. Introduce a player reproduction system where 2 players on the server with enough food could create a new player slot to allow previously dead or new players into the server. In following these general recommendations, I would advise not to simply increase how much food players need or decrease yields directly in loot drops and harvesting, as it can be annoying to players who are accustomed to needing a certain amount of food and yielding a certain amount from drops and harvests. I would recommend a more creative approach, such as progressive health drop as you get hungrier, or livestock needing a constant supply of food to stay alive and not just to reproduce. The same goes for all other modifications. Don't just increase how much iron goes into an iron pickaxe, for example. Make it actually harder to make a pickaxe by requiring ore to be maybe smelted and then immediately forged using special expensive utility blocks, something like that. In MagicGum's most recent video, he addressed some of these points. He actually introduced a thirst system, he introduced natural disasters, and environmental change. Unfortunately, the only consequential change in material requirements was during the Ice Age, when crops and livestock froze to death, making food hard to come by. Outside rules and expectations were especially strong during the late stages when special resources were introduced to incentivize trade and expansion. Because of the hesitancy in curtailing the individualist production loop, groups of players still had to be externally steered and directed into organizing into civilizations and expanding to other civilizations similar to the first experiment. I propose that a social production loop implemented in a civilization experiment in Minecraft through the use of mods would produce a much more complex, spontaneous, and interesting society with much more complex, spontaneous, and interesting politics, economics, and therefore storytelling. Without the guardrails and guidelines made by staff members and event organizers steering the development of civilizations, the viewer will feel that anything can happen, and that anything that does happen can be analyzed with much greater depth than in current experiments. For a simple example of how it can be more interesting for the viewer, compare games with an in-game economy that are set up by developers versus a game such as EVE Online that has an economy completely run by players and regulated by natural laws and is so interesting and has so much depth that multiple videos totaling tens of millions of views are being made to analyze it. Just imagine the ripple effects of even one large-scale experiment using a social production loop could generate, especially if participants record and upload their own POV to tell their own story. In terms of how the experiment should be structured, I recommend the event style that MagicGum pioneered instead of a full-time server, which would require a claim system to prevent griefing and theft when players are offline. Such systems could prevent emergent scenarios, such as in-game property laws, and could ruin both the players and the viewer's immersion. Having a set period of time, most likely 2 to 3 hours, a few days a week, or even 1 day a week, can let players rest easy after sessions, knowing that everything will be as they left it. This downtime in between sessions can also give space to role-playing elements, as players can plan and make decisions outside of the game. The combination of the social production loop and the event structure can give rise to truly unique forms of social organization. The different ways that groups of players organize and coordinate their production could be limitless. Another interesting question I want to have answered is, assuming that we start with many groups of players separated by distance, all developing their own societies, how will those societies develop over time? Will one form of social organization conquer the rest? What power structures will arise, if any? With a renewed emphasis on meeting material needs, will players be as focused on abstract goals as they were in past experiments? We can only really speculate until such an experiment is done, but hey, if this video gets a decent amount of support, I may just get together with some modders myself. If you'd be interested in a Minecraft civilization experiment with a social production loop, just let me know by giving this video a like and putting some feedback down in the comments section. See you in the next video.